Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop f1 to d3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight g1 to e2. Pawn c5 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Knight d7 to b6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn a2 to a3. Castle kingside. Pawn b2 to b3. Pawn f7 to f6. Knight d2 to f3. Pawn f6 takes e5. Knight f3 takes e5. Knight c6 takes e5. Pawn d4 takes e5. Pawn d5 to d4. Bishop c1 to d2. Bishop e7 to g5. Knight e2 takes d4. Bishop g5 takes d2. Bishop d3 takes h7, check. King g8 takes h7. Queen d1 takes d2. King h7 to g8. Rook a1 to c1. Knight b6 to d5. Rook f1 to d1. Bishop c8 to d7. Rook c1 to c4. Rook a8 to c8. Rook d1 to c1. Rook c8 takes c4. Rook c1 takes c4. Queen d8 to h4. Knight d4 takes e6. Queen h4 takes c4. Pawn b3 takes c4. Bishop d7 takes e6. Pawn c4 takes d5. Bishop e6 to f5. Pawn e5 to e6. Rook f8 to e8. Queen d2 to b4. Rook e8 to b8. Pawn e6 to e7. King g8 to f7. Pawn d5 to d6. King f7 to f6. Queen b4 to b2, check. King f6 to f7. Pawn g2 to g4. Bishop f5 takes g4. Pawn d6 to d7. King f7 takes e7. Queen b2 takes g7, check. King e7 to d6. Queen g7 to d4, check. King d6 to c6. Queen d4 to a4, check. King c6 to d5. Queen a4 to b3, check. King d5 to c6. Queen b3 to a4, check. King c6 to c5. Queen a4 takes a7, check. King c5 to d5. Queen a7 to a5, check. Pawn b7 to b5. Queen a5 to d2, check. King d5 to e4. Queen d2 to e1, check. King e4 to d4. Queen e1 to a1, check. King d4 to e4. Queen a1 to b1, check. King e4 to d4. Queen b1 to b2, check. King d4 to e4. Queen b2 to c2, check. King e4 to d4. Queen c2 to d2, check. King d4 to e5. Pawn f2 to f4, check. King e5 to f6. Queen d2 to b2, check. King f6 to e7. Queen b2 to g7, check. King e7 to d6. Queen g7 to d4, check. King d6 to c7. Queen d4 to a7, check. Rook b8 to b7. Pawn d7 to d8, promoting to queen, check. King c7 takes d8. Queen a7 takes b7. Bishop g4 to e2. King g1 to f2. Bishop e2 to d3. Queen b7 to d5, check. King d8 to c7. Queen d5 takes d3. King c7 to c6. Pawn h2 to h4. Pawn b5 to b4. Pawn a3 takes b4. King c6 to c7. Pawn b4 to b5. King c7 to b6. King f2 to e3. King b6 to c5. Pawn h4 to h5. King c5 to b6. King e3 to d4. King b6 to b7. Pawn f4 to f5. King b7 to c7. Queen d3 to a3. King c7 to d7. Pawn h5 to h6. King d7 to c7. Pawn h6 to h7. King c7 to d7. Queen a3 to g3. King d7 to e7. Queen g3 to c7, check. King e7 to f6. Queen c7 to e5, check. King f6 to f7. Pawn b5 to b6. King f7 to f8. Pawn b6 to b7. King f8 to f7. Pawn f5 to f6. King f7 to g6. Queen e5 to e7. King g6 to h6. Queen e7 to g7, check. King h6 to h5. Pawn h7 to h8, promoting to queen. Checkmate.